Okay, so we're going to have a chat about sustainability in the data center industry, which is, I guess, front and center has been for quite a while. But I'm wondering if we're perhaps getting to 2.0. The first one was the fairly easy stuff. There was a lot of carbon offsetting. And we now potentially at the point where people need to start making some quite tough business decisions. But I'm also wondering, is it still possible, sadly, for people, without naming names, but is it still rather too easy to greenwash and pretend you're doing things, or do some, was it Shell the other day when it was in the news that they're doing a load of carbon offsetting, but apparently if you drill under the covers, it's possibly not making a lot of difference. Just your thoughts on where we're at the moment, I guess.
Sure, I'm very happy to comment. I think we're at the beginning of what we need to be thinking about as an industry, broadly. And we are going to have to be thinking about it in a much greater level of detail and a greater level of transparency going forward than we've had to up to this point. And one of the things that we try to encourage everybody, whether that is our partners, whether it's our customers, frankly, whether it's our peers, the other data center operators, we encourage everybody to think about the practicality of sustainability, its effectiveness in any given location, but maybe most importantly and increasingly important is the way in which reporting is done and the transparency behind that reporting. And one of the things that's very clear at the moment is that there is no standard. There is no one solution that fits all reporting requirements. And it's been very easy as a result for those that want to take advantage of that lack of consistency, that lack of standardization, to say, well, we're doing a great job. Look over here, we've got a green data center or a green digital infrastructure solution. But in fact, really, when you start to scratch beneath the surface, what you find is that it's very easy to make those statements with minimal impact and minimal effort, actually. So we're not necessarily going to sit here and criticize the way in which that's happening, because actually all we're really calling for is more transparency across the board and a standardization. So one of the things that we did recently was actually put this in a blog only several months ago. And we were very clear on our own reporting, our own standard numbers and statistics, the metrics by which we want to be measured by, the metrics which we think the industry should be measured by. Now, the interesting thing about that in itself is that because there is no standard, it's going to take a number of people starting to report on the same basis to then encourage others to look at it that way. But one of the things I think that's really changed in the last couple of years, maybe even more so in the last 12 months than any other time period, is that the attention is finally on sustainability that it really deserved and deserves going forward. And that pressure is only going to continue. I think there's every possibility that in the future we may see some form of regulation in certain industries. But actually, I think probably the thing that's going to happen first is going to be the peer pressure to report on sustainability and the use of carbon across an entire supply chain. It doesn't matter what the industry is. We often see the financial services industry being the first industry to get clobbered by regulation, no matter what, when these types of things come about. And they may well be the first target, given what's being talked about at the moment. But I think every industry is going to face peer pressure. So the end users, the customers, the people that are using compute and data centers are the ones that are actually really starting to ask the questions. And I think when we look at the reporting that's being done across the board in the industry so far, it's not consistent. It's definitely not transparent. And it's certainly got a long way to go for standardization. But things are beginning to happen. And I think those that have come forward with transparent reporting should be applauded for that. And you are starting to see that. If you look at the likes of the big hyperscalers, for example, Google is, just by example, doing a fantastic job at starting to report more transparently. And I think we should all sit here and applaud the way in which they're going about it. They've still got a long way to go. And they do talk, even in their annual reports, around things like the greenhouse gas protocol emissions under scope 1, 2, and 3. But they really only transparently report and use statistics on scope 1 and 2. But that only goes so far. Now, it's very easy for them to report on numbers where They're talking about scope 1 and 2 improvements. But actually, when you take into account scope 1, 2, and 3, it's very difficult, given the growth that is going on in the industry, to do anything other than look at the focal point of where they're improving rather than not. And if you take into account all scope 1, 2, and 3 statistics, actually their emissions are growing enormously on an annual basis, but the whole industry is. And I think that's one of the things that we've really got to start focusing on, which is, because there is such an enormous growth in the industry, we cannot be expected to not be using more carbon across the globe, but it's the percentage of carbon, and it's the improvements, and it's the drive to make those improvements that's the really important bit. And so again, it comes back to this point about standardization. And I think that's one of the key areas that I think we'd like to see across the industry that is so lacking at the moment. There's various organizations starting to talk about this. So we're starting to see things like the data center pacts that have been developed, the climate neutral data center pact as an example, something that we're a member of. Some of the climate accords, for example, the iMasons climate accords that's been well adopted by a number of operators, starting to try to standardize and create that transparency on reporting. So that's really where we're wanting to see the improvements, and we're really starting to see people edge in the right direction. But at the moment, it is all too easy to continue the greenwashing that exists, because it's very easy for any data center operator to say in a given location, well, I buy power that can be certified. It has a guarantee of origin, whether that's a simple purchase agreement or whether it's something more complicated with a direct PPA agreement. But it's very easy to do that. And then you see the labeling of that actually on any of the operations that may exist in locations that clearly can't be carbon neutral. And we really have to encourage the end users, the customers, to think about that. Is it logical to just take the assumption that a green data center can exist in London or Frankfurt? Well, it's not possible, and everybody understands that, but often the questions aren't asked. Now, there's also the other side of that, which is there's only so much you can do in a location like that, and we totally acknowledge that all compute cannot possibly be green at the moment, because there are very few places on the planet that have sustainable energy production. So it's impossible to suddenly turn the industry green, and some applications, data and workflows will need to sit in those locations that are heavily biased towards carbon. One of the things we really focus on is trying to educate end users, educate customers, help customers take that journey that is only really just beginning. Coming back to my first point, we are just at the beginning of this, but take that journey towards sustainability and enable them to think about where they should put their digital infrastructure, where their data center footprint should sit. And one of the things we're really excited to see is that applications can sit in different locations, and customers are thinking that way finally. So a number of customers across the globe will make decisions to put some of their applications in a cloud environment. And by virtue, that means that many of those applications could sit in other locations, like Nordic locations. One of the things we encourage our customers to think about is, can you put some of your applications and data in a Nordic location and other applications in metro locations, for example? And that's really something that is only just beginning as we all start to think about the broader industry impact and the transparency required around it.
Okay, and in terms of that sort of standardization, you've mentioned that there's perhaps two parts to it. There's the ESG bit, as you say, to come up with a standard set of metrics or whatever reporting, whether that's for the data center industry or whether we need one right across industry so that you can compare different industries, different companies from different sectors. But also I'm wondering, I think we've got sort of local authorities are already pushing back slightly on data center development, but do you see it's inevitable that governments will start introducing legislation around what data centers can and can't do, whether it's legacy ones or at least when it comes to new build?
Sure, and it's interesting. The Uptime Institute just published their main predictions for the year. And one of the things they heavily comment on is the influence that we might start to see from either government, local or national level, and certainly where you're observing some of the main challenges around power availability, power pricing, power stability, we've seen such a dramatic impact that perhaps was created as at least a stimulus point that has now had massive implications across other countries as well. But from the war that started between Russia and Ukraine, you've then seen this waterfall that has had power pricing, stability, and availability impacts across all sorts of countries throughout Europe, most countries, in fact. Every country has probably been impacted in some way, some more so than others. So when you take the case of Germany, where power pricing is probably about the highest it is in Europe, and has other challenges around the sustainability of their grid from the generation mix that they have, and the fact that they're a significant importer of energy generation, that's clearly a grid that is going to have the kind of constraints that we're talking about. And at local level, before we talk about the government national level, at local level, you're seeing significant constraints where there's been massive deployments at local level for data centers over the last several years and continue to be so. So if you take an example of, for example, Frankfurt, where the power constraints are very observable, and frankly, there is unlikely to be much power available to new developments and new expansions in that city and surrounding area for a few years, that's really going to put a natural constraint, and it doesn't actually need sort of local intervention at the government level. It's happening by virtue of supply and demand, and the market forces are interacting there that are having that impact. But if you then look at cases where it's been going on for longer for other reasons, other supply demand reasons, take example Dublin, well, you've got actually the government at national level intervening, let alone the general Dublin area intervening and starting to put certain restrictions on the types of development and the way in which data center campuses and operations are developed over the years ahead, with certain specific requirements there at the local level. So I think you're actually starting to see that already, national and local level government intervention. Some of it is relying upon market forces, but other is really starting to see some genuine intervention. And I think we're set to see that continue. One of the fascinating things about power generation is the rate at which it can be deployed. It takes a very, very long time to build more energy capacity, energy generation capacity. And larger projects can take a decade, sometimes a decade and a half to deploy, if you think about the very substantial deployments for power stations, whichever source they may be relying upon. That's a seriously long period of time when you're seeing the growth in our industry, soaking up often any excess power that exists in a given local area. And this is really where the fundamental challenge exists. You've got an enormous amount of power being consumed at a rapid rate. This growth is outstripping the generation capability that can be deployed, probably for the next decade plus. So the big issue that I think we have, not just at country level, but broadly, and we think about Europe, but if you think about this going on all over the world, it's exactly the same situation. We've just seen an announcement, if you follow the US North American market, where the general Virginia Commonwealth has just disclosed that it's going to have unbelievably large amounts of expansion from some of its hyperscale customers. And when you look at those numbers, it's hard to fathom where all of that power is coming from, given the already limited power available. So we're in a position where the growth in our industry is so enormous, it is going to outstrip supply. So the impact of that is either going to be massively increased prices or restricted supply in certain local and potentially even national level deployment capabilities. So this forces the data center operators, the hyperscale developers, to really think very carefully about their deployments. And that's really what's creating some of the challenges. I think as we head forward over the next couple of years, it would be our expectation that you're going to see more intervention. So answering your question directly, I think our expectation is that you'll see more local level and maybe even national level intervention to restrict or perhaps slow down the development. That's going to create a very interesting dynamic for our entire industry over the years ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, before we move on to other topics, do you think there'll need to be, or should there be, and it's very difficult because governments obviously want to get re-elected, and telling everyone they can't, use their electricity or whatever it is not popular. But do you think there needs to be a bigger debate about, as consumers, we're all used to storing vast amounts of photos for next to no money at all, and et cetera, et cetera. Do you think at some stage somebody needs to step in and say, well, we can't just carry on with unfettered digital consumption? We do need to either put a price, sort of control in, or, as you say, back to the peer pressure, people need to start naming and shaming. If you've got 20,000 pictures in the cloud, perhaps that's not, except that's maybe a trivial example, but is that something that somehow needs to be addressed? But I say, with governments looking to be re-elected, they're perhaps reluctant to go down that road.
Yeah, it's a very difficult one. I think that's almost impossible to predict the dynamics of that, but there's some interesting facts around it. So if you think about the likely impact, consumers, particularly at the non-enterprise end, so you and me, and the general population, we're just going to continue to consume more data. We're creating more data. We're creating more content. We're consuming more content. The latest statistics of the content distribution and international internet traffic were just released a couple of weeks ago, and you can see these enormous statistics appearing of this, something that we're all fully aware of, just continued growth in data and content creation. That's very, very difficult to slow down because we will always be taking more photos, always be writing more emails, always creating more documents and so on. We all know that. But then how do you start to control that at a macro level? I think that's almost impossible. And the only way that you're likely to be able to do anything about that is by incurring some kind of levy, some kind of charge. But of course, you've got to remember that technology moves, particularly on a platform basis, in an incredibly fickle way. So if you start to have price increments for using one particular platform, most users will switch to another platform within days. So I think that's an almost impossible one to solve, particularly in anything like the short term that we're really talking about here in terms of the sustainability impact. Perhaps over the long term, that might be something that comes in. But if you think about the adoption of technology, one of the things that we've seen rapidly appearing over the course of the last 12, 24 months is the broad stream adoption of artificial intelligence, machine learning. And when we look at the cost, the impact of that, so if you were to do a Google search and compare it with doing a chat GPT search, for example, the costs are something like 10-fold higher on a chat GPT algorithm search. And of course, that will come down over time, but there's always that next level that's consuming more power, growing more rapidly. And that pattern is unlikely to change. So I think it's incredibly hard to break that mold. And I think we're going to be in an environment for decades, not just years, where we're only ever going to see just a continual replacement cycle where growth in data consumption and creation is greater and greater. You look at the artificial intelligence generation models and the artificial intelligence training models that are starting to appear across the industry. They're consumers of the most phenomenal amounts of power, and we're only just at the beginning. So is there going to be an ability to target one part of the industry, one segment efficiently without the substitution effect likely stepping in almost immediately? I think that's almost impossible. So I think that's a very difficult one. I think that the challenge has to be tackled a slightly different way, which is really a focus on, again, I would argue it's all about transparency. It's about reporting standards, and it's about saying, is this the right thing at a macro level that filters down to the micro so that end users can make informed decisions about where their compute sits, how their compute is distributed, and whether that can be done in a more efficient manner going forward.
And in terms of, you referenced earlier on the greenhouse gases and the scopes 1, 2, and 3. It's clearly a good attempt to understand, consumption and environmental impact, but it's not the complete picture. And I've had some folks point out that, although it's not a bad starting point, it, for example, I think, water is probably not covered by, etc. But do you think there's a need for a more comprehensive 1, 2, and 3, or whatever you want to call it, to bring in everything that relates to environmental impact, stroke sustainability, rather than, as you say, back to earlier, everyone says about scope 1, 2, and 3, and maybe doesn't look too much at scope 3, because apart from anything else, it's very difficult to perhaps obtain all the figures accurately from your wider supply base. But yeah, just thoughts as to what might work better than that starting point.
Sure, and I'd love to have the perfect answers to this, because I'd love to be able to predict exactly where we're going to end up. But there's all sorts of forces that will contribute into the different standards that are being thought about and developed. And a lot of work, I referred to a couple of the kind of pacts and some of the foundations that are starting to really think about this. There's a lot of contributors who are very passionate about this. And actually, if you look at how the membership of a lot of these different organizations now, there's a lot of people putting a lot of good work and thought into this. One of the things we did last year was publish the point you've just been talking about, which is greenhouse gas emission protocols scope 1, 2, and 3 statistics. That's fine, that's great. It serves part of the purpose, but it is only part of the reporting. So we also provided clear statistics on some of the other things that are perhaps more geared and specific towards the data center industry. So I think the entire industry is very familiar with utilization effectiveness statistics around power, the PUE, and that power utilization effectiveness is a very important metric, but it's not the only metric. And one of the things that has been really focused on over the course of the last couple of years, you're starting to see water, you mentioned it. So the WUE, the water utilization effectiveness, and the carbon utilization effectiveness. Now, one of the things that's a pretty interesting tie to one of the earlier comments is carbon utilization effectiveness could potentially be almost zero if you're going down the path of greenwashing. So it's it's easy to mask some of the underlying statistics. So if you are to report on the metrics that we report on of PUE, WUE, and CUE, power, water, and carbon utilization effectiveness, we're absolutely clear on that as a good starting point, and encourage everybody to do that as an operator or significant data center user. And that gets you a long way when you combine that with greenhouse gas, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions data as well. So you're starting to look at it from different perspectives if you're reporting all 6 of those data points. But it then also doesn't account for some of the other things that the whole industry needs to think about. And that there's a long way to go. And I think what we're really trying to encourage is reporting on a broader basis. Whilst we're almost waiting for standardization to be created, there is no global standard if you actually report properly on, for example, the utilization effectiveness ratings. You're using ISO standards, which we do. And that's another really important thing, that you see a lot of these statistics being thrown out there, but they're not reported under the true calculation of the internationally accepted ISO standard. And so it's really about the scrutiny, even on these early standardization of metrics, that we need to focus on, because it's very easy, even under more transparent reporting, to greenwash even those statistics. And I think one of the things that the whole, it's not just the data center industry, but frankly, the whole user base of any carbon, any energy around the planet really needs to focus on is what is the specific level of reporting for a given industry. And that is starting to come through. So these working groups, these pacts are really starting to put a lot of thought into that. And I think it's only going to be the course of the next year or two where we'll start to see some requirements. There are recommendations already out there by a number of these organizations of what we should be targeting by given timelines. So, for example, the Climate Neutral Data Center Pact has very clear targets for the data center industry to hit by 2030, and encouraging its user base and beyond that to hit those. So I think it's going to be work in progress. And one of the very interesting things beyond that is that a lot of operators have not even tracked this data previously. So it's going to take a while for the standardization to come through. if not just because many operators haven't even stopped to think about it in some cases. So a long way to go, but I think it's a combination of broader metrics associated that with our industry that can cover one part of the reporting, which is things like emissions data. Then I think we'll start to see some more specific work done on science-based targets. And I think we'll also see some very specific data center utilization effectiveness targets really being adopted by the industry more broadly. And it'll be that mix together of all three different types that I think we're going to start to adopt as an industry, hopefully over the years ahead.
And I mean, you mentioned peer pressure earlier, particularly obviously from customers demanding the data. Do you think the data center companies themselves, you mentioned some of these, the EU Code of Conduct, the climate neutral data center practice. I mean, is there increasing pressure on data center organizations to join these and not to be left out? Or is there going to be a tipping point when, if you're not part of one of these things, you're going to look pretty lonely? Or are you, companies like yourself that are, should we say, ahead of the curve? Are you able to put pressure on some of your peers in the industry, or is it very much up to each individual company to kind of come to their own decision and roadmap around it?
Well, I think it's always going to be up to every individual company, but it's that peer pressure point that I think is going to exist, at least in the short term. But the one thing that is changing is that customers are asking, and that's genuinely something recent. We set up our first operation, our first data center in Iceland, for all of the reasons that now sit at the front of this type of conversation. It's a country that can truly say that all of its power is generated from renewable energy. It's still the only country in Europe that can say that legitimately. And we have the ability to provide very efficient data center solutions because of the natural climate. Now, we made that decision at the outset, and I would argue that we wanted people to really think that way over a decade ago. And it's actually only in the last few years that it has been more of a pull than a push. What I mean by that is that we have been saying to customers, please think about this. Please think about the sustainability of your compute for well over a decade. And now we're getting the pull from customers saying, we want to have sustainability for our data centers. Do you have a solution? And that's what's changed. So it's now the customers starting to think that way, to ask that way. And one of the things we can definitely see is that some of the end users, the data center customers who don't have legacy, they don't have data center infrastructure that's existed without having any thought towards sustainability, that when they're starting from scratch, if they think about it from the outset, and they invariably do if they don't have that legacy infrastructure, then it's much easier for them to make a decision from the outset of their deployment. And what I'm referring to there is a lot of companies that are starting to develop new infrastructure, new demand for the type of compute that we're talking about in, for example, machine learning impacts across every industry. So when you look at a company that maybe has only been running for the last 5 years, they're actually making a decision from the outset that they're going to go down the path of sustainable digital infrastructure. But it's much harder if you have legacy infrastructure that exists in multiple locations, in metro locations that have carbon grids that provide their energy. So I think the bit that is flipping is that it's becoming customer-led. And we'd love to say that that's something that started a long time ago, but it really didn't. And for us, that's been as an operator that's been at the front of that positioning for over 10 years, yeah, we've really seen that shift in the last couple of years. And that messaging is really starting to accelerate, really starting to grab the attention. So I think it's something that I'd love to say has existed for a long time, but it really is only getting the attention that it deserves now.
You referenced legacy data centers. I'm always intrigued by that because, I mean, theoretically, there's only so much you can do with a, I don't know, 10, 15, 20-year-old building to make it sustainable. Do you think that at some stage, and clearly it's difficult, bear in mind what you said earlier, that there's just more and more pressure, we need more and more, but will a lot of these legacy data centers just have to be either sort of knocked down and start again, because obviously there's some power there, which is useful, or can put it another way, can a 15, 20-year-old data center ever be truly sustainable, judged against, a greenfield site where you can presumably build it sustainable from the foundations up?
Yeah, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that not all locations have the perfect attributes of sustainable data center capability. I think it's really important to acknowledge. I think what we need to think about is a slightly more holistic positioning, where some buildings are going to be older, some buildings are going to be sitting in city center locations, some buildings are going to be sitting in perfectly aligned, sustainable, carbon-free, carbon-neutral locations. And it's trying to ensure that we do as much as we possibly can to optimize any given location. And that's the critical point. Even old infrastructure can be improved. And it's to some extent down to marginal gains and improvements that we can improve as an entire industry. And if we think about that at the macro level, the industry level, perhaps that takes on a slightly more altruistic view than some operators might. But if we can really think about that as an industry broadly, then we have a great opportunity at improving the overall efficiency of an entire system. The system that I'm referring to there is the entire data center footprint. So I think we have to be very clear on the fact that you can always improve the efficiency of a given building if it has legacy infrastructure, if it has older technology in its cooling equipment, if it has an ability to take a building that sits in a city center and connect to a heat grid and then suddenly reuse the heat, or take cooling from a heat grid. Those are the kind of things that actually we should be starting to look at, optimizing even the older infrastructure and modernizing it, making it more efficient because we have new technology. We're also about to see an influx of much denser compute. And if you look at it from higher up the stack than just the pure infrastructure level, we should be optimizing applications. We should even be thinking about the code. How efficient is it? Is it going to consume more power with inefficient code? Should we be thinking about the hardware very clearly and optimizing the location of a given type of hardware? Is the latest, densest NVIDIA supercomputer DGX equipment going to sit nicely in a data center in Hamburg versus a data center in Iceland? Well, the answer is it's going to naturally sit more efficiently in an environment that was built for high density. And yet, actually, if you look at the type of compute that is coming and talk to all of the hardware manufacturers at the moment, the density is increasing. It's going to consume more power. It's going to get hotter, need more cooling. So can we really provide that in legacy locations, older locations? Well, I think we can improve older locations. And we've got a perfect example of that. We operate a data center in London, which sits alongside our positioning around Nordic compute, and have the ability to help our customers by thinking about their infrastructure in different locations, by helping them to think about the optimization of one application type in a given location that may be more latency sensitive. That may well need to be in a city center location, but actually the rest of their footprint might not. So starting to encourage customers to think about the application portfolio, or the portfolio of different data that they might have, how it's used, and optimizing that from the top down as well as from the bottom up. And that's really something that hasn't happened very much, because the easy button for most end users has been, let's put all of our applications and all of our data in one location with one operator. But actually the industry is becoming more sophisticated. And when you've got resources that are constrained, and we're starting to see the dynamics of that from what we've just been talking about, how much capacity is left in Frankfurt, for example. Well, what about other choices? Where else could you think about geographically, or where else could you think about given the type of hardware you might be using? If it gets denser, is it really going to sit in a data center that was designed, going back to this legacy point, for 5 kilowatts per rack, when some of these very high-end boxes are now drawing 7.5 kilowatts per box? So that's some of the dynamics that are changing quite rapidly, that I think we can always improve any given location, any given infrastructure. There's new technology that enables us to be more efficient. But if you combine that with the messaging and education with customers thinking about their compute in a different way, which is enabled by high-speed internet connectivity of terrestrial systems and subsea cable systems to different countries, that's something that really was a technology that has existed for a while, but hasn't necessarily been harnessed. And that's something that we're starting to see more rapidly now, perhaps driven for the wrong reasons, i.e. power price increases that were unexpected. But that's actually what's starting to have huge impacts. One of the things we're seeing a lot of at the moment is customers coming to us saying, well, my data center costs have risen by 3 times in the last 12 months. What about in Nordic locations? Well, in fact, for example, in Iceland, not only were we able to provide very stable pricing solutions, but they're up to 75% lower cost when you compare it to certain metro locations, many metro locations in Europe. So with those kind of savings, plus the ability to actually move compute to a truly sustainable environment, that's what's finally capturing the real focus of end users at the moment. So I think that there's 2 parts to that. You can always improve the efficiency of a given location, a given building, but you can also look at how you define what is being used in that building or infrastructure and start to optimize both of those. And you get a macro picture and an industry-wide picture that starts to become more efficient and more sustainable over time.
Yeah. So I guess you say because of the need for more capacity, maybe we're not going to trash a load of older data centers, but when the newer ones, you say locations like the Nordics and more environmentally friendly locations, they may gain impetus. The other thing I'm intrigued in, and I don't know the answer, I don't know if there is an easy answer, but there's a lot of building out of edge infrastructure. Yep. Is that inherently more or less sort of energy efficient, environmentally friendly, or does it not matter what size a data center is, or do you get economies of scale? Any thoughts as to whether edge data centers are sort of making the problem worse or a part of the solution?
A part of the solution. Edge data centers still very much need to be defined. Everyone's got a slightly different definition of what an edge data center really is at the moment. But I think we're absolutely going to see more data center footprints that are more geographically spread. They may well also be smaller in nature and more of them rather than single, very substantial locations, which are also going to exist. You're going to see the continued dominance, most likely from the hyperscale geographical demand that has really been driving a substantial part of the market in the course of the last few years. But as you start to see the proliferation of data that actually needs to be spread around more efficiently, perhaps that ends up being led by 5G technology as it starts to become adopted over the years ahead. Perhaps it's driven by solutions that are maybe more mobile around connected cars when they eventually start to become more mainstream in the next decade or so. So I think we're only just at the very beginning of edge as a concept, that you're going to see that pushing out from the hubs that exist. I don't think that necessarily is going to make the industry or the way in which the infrastructure in the industry combines to become more inefficient. I think it actually just pushes data and perhaps solves some of the challenges that we've got and we've been talking about, because it will reduce the concentration if everything were in one location. So actually, I think there's an opportunity for that to become mainstream over the years ahead as just part of the overall solution. I think it's inevitable that you're going to see smaller sites, the edge sites, define whether it's sort of smaller multiple location if you're defining edge, or whether it's just part of a more of a map that is distributed because it happens to be in city centers that don't have the kind of dominance of the primary or secondary markets. But it's coming, and it's going to continue to proliferate as we see more compute, more data being consumed and generated across the planet. So I think it's just part of the solutions, part of the challenges that we need to think about. But I think it will actually, to some extent, benefit the entire, because it will just relieve some of the energy requirements for the entire industry.
Okay, I've taken up a lot of your time, so I promise this is the last question. But in terms of what needs to happen now, um, I would suggest that we've had a bit of a sort of evolution up to now, slowly. Do you think that can carry on, or do we need a bit of a revolution, as you've been hinting? People need to think long and hard as to where certain applications reside, which data centers to use. And then, for the data centers themselves, I know liquid cooling, talk to IT veterans, was around in the 70s, but it's obviously coming back, with a vengeance now. Does the industry need to, say, step change to move fast to do what it needs to do quickly, or can it sort of, drift along for the next 25 years until 2050 when we're all supposed to, achieve net zero or not?
I think the biggest impediment is likely to be around power availability. We're simply not going to have, going back to that point that I made earlier, we're not going to have the availability of power to serve the consumption in core markets that exist today, by which I mean the primary and secondary data center markets around Europe and North America and Asia, unless we start to think about infrastructure slightly differently. And I think the main challenge is that the delivery of additional power is going to take many years. Even the most rapid deployment of new energy generation, which is via solar and wind, that still takes several years in planning. And obviously it's not a persistent source of power, it's intermittent. So it solves part of the problem. So we will see continued development of additional energy generation and production capability, but it does take many, many years, and it is running very short of the total growth in energy and power consumption that is going on in our industry. And so that is going to force some dynamics to change. So I think it naturally is going to be a bit of an evolution, because there's only so much that can happen in a given space of time in the industry. And actually the industry is not starting from scratch. It's a very well-established industry, and it's one that as a result has plenty of legacy and has things that will take time to change. But I think the thing that can accelerate that is a focus on reporting standards, the transparency, going back again to an earlier point, but the ability for end users to see the type of energy and the carbon impact that they have by using a given data center location or given type of data center infrastructure. I think that's going to go a long way to starting to make a more rapid change. And I think if we as an industry adopt more standardization, it will make that process speed up even further, because the decision will then become simpler for the end users. But I think that the thing that we're probably going to be driven by, unfortunately, is this enormous price increase that's been seen in energy in Europe is forcing people to make a more rapid decision about their infrastructure than they would have done otherwise. And that impact, which then moves on to supply availability and resiliency, I think that's actually the bit that's going to cause more of a revolution than evolution. And I think that's probably going to speed up and accelerate the rate at which this change happens. And that probably in the long term will be for the good, and is an unfortunate catalyst given the beginning, the reason why it started to happen so quickly. But I think overall it will accelerate the path towards sustainability, and that's probably a good thing for the entire industry.
Okay, well, as I say, I've taken up a lot of your time. I'm really grateful for the answers you've given and the insight. So Dominic, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Phil.